So, hello and welcome everyone to this episode of Europe Responds, brought to you by the EU ISS. So, my name is Andrei Dietrich, and I'm the senior analyst for Russia and the Eastern Neighborhood. And I'm joined today by Stephen Everts, the EU ISS director. Welcome, Stephen. We do not have our regular host this program, Giuseppe Spatafora, because it's nearly holiday season, but it will be more of a conversation that Stephen and I will have also, of course, together with you, because we would like to have a Q&A session after sort of the first round of exchanges. This is a pretty consequential week for Ukraine and also for the EU, with the upcoming European Council meeting discussing, among a number of other things, of course, how the EU will continue to support, to fund Ukraine in the next years. And this, of course, happens against the backdrop of very intense negotiations on the peace framework terms among Ukraine and its partners. So perhaps, Stephen, can we first hear your take on what the sort of the wider stakes of the process are, in which we can then maybe situate, the discussion of the options that the EU has at the moment.
No, absolutely, Andrei. I think it's indeed a consequential week. Europe, I think, is under pressure, is being tested. There's a lot of talk about whether the EU is able to take decisions at the scale and the speed that are required. And I think there are at least two big chunks of that. Mercosur is one element, but we're not going to talk about that. But it's part of, I think, of the wider framework. But of course, Ukraine is top of the agenda. And as you rightly say, I think the question before us is: are we able to sort of live up to our own commitments, our own rhetoric of supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, which we routinely describe as existential for Ukraine, but also for ourselves? And can we mobilize the resources politically, militarily, but then also financially to keep Ukraine in the fight and to prevent what I think is the fear that many Europeans have, which is a bad deal for Ukraine, but also a bad deal for ourselves. And at the Institute, we've together done a lot of work on this and how to do this. And I think the jury is out. I mean, I wish, frankly, we're now on the eve of the European Council. Tomorrow, leaders will meet. Normally, what happens in European affairs is that at the beginning, there's a lot of discussion and also quite some tense negotiations, but there's a degree of element of convergence really in the run-up to the summit, and then leaders can put the final deal together. I think right now, we don't know. Good news, in my view, is that in Berlin earlier this week, there was really a degree of convergence around the diplomatic dimension of all of this. And you referred to this idea of a framework, and there's been, I think, more convergence between Europeans, Ukrainians, and Americans, which there wasn't earlier in the month, around the key sort of parameters of how a peace deal, a sustainable peace, might look. But then, of course, we all know, you and me know very well, I mean, we may agree more amongst Western allies, but there's no sign whatsoever on the side of Russia, which hasn't moved 1 inch on anything. It still maintains its maximalist goals. So we will have to see sort of where that goes. Now, on the European side of things, and I guess that brings us now to the sort of the core of this discussion this morning. What can we as European Union, what can we as Europeans do in support of Ukraine? Because there may not be a peace deal, and or we have to forestall a bad peace deal. And what does it take? And I think one element, and perhaps you can develop a bit more, because I know that you've been thinking about it, is indeed this question of financing. Now, everybody knows intense discussion on multiple options on the table, which have supporters, but also have obstacles. They have pros, they have cons. Can you maybe walk us through a little bit how you see these options and how they might pan out?
Happy to. Thanks. Thanks for this, Stephen. So yes, the context is that Ukraine has serious need for finance, right? The IMF calculated this together with the Ukrainian government at 135 billion for 2026 and 2027. That's one element of this. Then, of course, the EU coffers are not sort of bottomless, and the EU has, challenges of mobilizing additional significant resources, right? So, in this context, the reparation loan appeared as sort of a more acceptable proposal, I would say, than previously, because the idea, of course, of using the frozen assets, of which there is up to 210 billion in the EU, the vast majority, of course, in Belgium, held by Euroclear, but also elsewhere sort of appeared. So the mechanics of this is fairly well known. So what the Commission proposes now is an initial 90 billion euro loan to cover 2/3 of the funding needs of Ukraine for the next two years, while the rest sort of remains disponible, right? And 45 billion is set aside to repay the ERA loans, so to maintain the initiative backed originally by the windfalls of these assets, which we already have been using, right? So the way this works is that the EU issues sort of these 0% interest bonds backed by a group of member states, and Euroclear and other banks and entities that hold the Russian assets will buy and put them on the balance sheet. So the construction is this is a little bit technical, but perhaps still important, is this, that sort of the claims and the assets of the central bank of Russia on one hand, and the cash balances accumulating on the balance sheets as a result of the immobilization that was done already in February, March 2022, are separated. So the assets are not touched, i.e. confiscated. Though, of course, Euroclear and others are sort of forced to buy. They have this obligation to make this investment, and the bonds can only be redeemed once Russia pays Ukraine the reparations, to which we believe, and this is an important point, Ukraine is entitled to by international law. Now, there is a lot of politics around it, some sort of concerns over higher debt costs for the EU, capital outflow if the loan is interpreted as effective confiscation, have sort of been attenuated over the past months, but still some concerns remain. In addition to financial stability, these concerns touch on Russia potential claims over these assets, Russia reprisals, of course, as well, the US response, because the administration disliked the idea originally, at least because it seems to want to use the assets in its potential future reconstruction fund, and integrated this into this peace framework. There are also concerns about the use of the Article 122, to which you referred, which sort of additionally strengthen the immobilization in addition to the sanctions regime. What this would mean for the future of decision making in CFSP matters. And of course, we have Russia on the other hand, which of course, as you rightly mentioned, shows no signs that it would be willing to accept whatever deal it is presented at the moment, saying, oh, well, now our security concerns, quote unquote, are not addressed. And they, of course, stoke the anxiety and try to influence the outcome of our EU's decision on these frozen assets, saying we will litigate, we can potentially even confiscate, both sort of the state and private assets in Russia, right? Now, the Commission believes that it addressed many of these concerns by proposed protections, decreasing and mutualizing the risk. But ultimately, this will be a very political question, of course, to take, because the Council can take the decision by qualified majority. But either if it takes it or it doesn't, this can have political repercussions. Euroclear would have to play along, of course, even if Belgium is not supporting the proposal. So we will really have to see. The bottom line, I think, is that it's very unlikely that Ukraine would be left without the necessary funding. We already have a decision back from October in which 26 member states committed to address the financial needs, but also there is support for some sort of alternative options which have their own shortcomings as well, both for Ukraine, and I'll get back to this before passing back to you in a second, and for the EU. This can be the joint borrowing, right, backed by the MFF, which would, however, require unanimity, either as a sort of a bridging loan on the premise that the war is perhaps about to stop. I think this is a very unlikely proposition, but is shared by some, or as something sort of more substantial. Or we can have a special purpose vehicle put together by national state contributions. So what this means, I think, and this will be something that we can come back to a little bit later, given that the probability that the war, Russia's war on Ukraine, will be halted in the coming weeks or so, the support of Ukraine defenses is key. And to me, it's a sort of a key security guarantee for Ukraine, to which we as the EU can contribute. And the reparations loan actually has this element built in the proposal, right? Because the proposal foresees that up to 115 billion would be used for defense until 2030. There is an element of covering the macro-financial needs, recharging the Ukraine facility. This is to support sort of the budget, right? But there is also a lot on defense. There is a sort of Cascadian principle introduced. So majority potentially of the funds should go sort of an upgrade of this Danish model to finance defense industrial production in Ukraine. Then there is an element of procurement done in the EU or EEA, EFTA states, and there is an element also for other third country providers. And I'm coming to an end. This is the reparations loan. For the other options, the defense element is much less clear, right? Because, as I mentioned, for any joint borrowing, we would have to have unanimity of member states, and we have some member states that are skeptical to agree to this, or to agree if defense support assistance is to be covered. So we might end up with some sort of a combination of a joint borrowing and national contributions just for the defense or so, but it's much less clear. So on this note on finance, I will stop, and maybe we can discuss a bit, the more general ways that the EU can support Ukraine, the security guarantees, diplomatic support, and I would ask you, Stephen, maybe to start us off on this.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Andre. Yeah, it was, I think, very helpful that you walked us through what is quite a complex file, and there are different elements, and they also change a little bit over time. But I think it's helpful. But indeed, it's very important that I think all of us are clear that if we do not go for the reparations loan, and let's see where eventually leaders going to end up, it is a decision by QMV in the end. But of course, there's an enormous and understandable and rightly so reluctance to potentially take a decision without the support of the country that is most affected. And there are even systemic ramifications for us doing so. But it is equally true that if we don't do the reparations loan because it gets blocked or postponed, that there are real consequences flowing from that. One is reputational. It'll be the media and the public will be full of the EU is incapable at the moment of strategic necessity to pull together and take strategic decisions in line with our interest and our own rhetoric. So it's really, in that sense, I think it sends a very bad signal about how we see ourselves, how partners will see us around the world, not just Americans, but around the world. This will be a very bad signal and will be full of recriminations. Who was to blame and who blocked and what does it mean? So that's one set of consequences. And the other set of consequences, indeed, as you say, is if you go for more mixed models, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit, you lose this sort of inbuilt benefits that the structure of the reparations loan had in the kind of support that is foreseen. And indeed, I think it has to be the case that we overwhelmingly prioritize collectively our support for defense production inside Ukraine. And the Danish model is, and it's not, by the way, not just the Danes. There are other member states in the EU that do this too, and rightly so. then indeed a further ring around it of enhanced support from European defense industries towards Ukraine. There are many, many capabilities that, including in the field of air defense. I mean, a lot of discussions around Patriots. Patriots are very good, they're very effective. But there are also very effective European systems, the SAMP-T and the other French-Italian system or there are other systems that Ukraine will benefit from enormously, that we do produce in Europe and we could make available to Ukraine, and we must. And then a third, final ring, that there may be some very specific capabilities that they don't produce in Ukraine, we don't produce in Europe, and that only the United States has. But it has, of course, it has downsides too, because remember, in an earlier phase, when we were in a much more complicated, negative phase of the negotiations of the Russia-US talks on Ukraine, at a certain point, the White House was threatening to withhold the delivery of weapons that Europeans had already paid for towards Ukraine. So anything you buy in the United States, yes, I understand, but it comes with risks. So this then brings us on to the sort of wider field that, what can Europe do in under any scenario, regardless sort of where these negotiations eventually end up. And I think you and me, we share a certain degree of skepticism on where they're going to end up, view the persistent Russian refusal to make any move whatsoever. I think this is the sort of mindset that we must have, that in 2026 and beyond, Europeans must organize themselves to provide this kind of long-term support for Ukraine across the board. And it's important that we try to do this really together at 27, and there's then the option of the EU at 26, which has sort of emerged on the file of Ukraine as a format, and sometimes that's necessary. And it will also be done more and more, I think, in terms of coalitions of the willing. I regret this as a European, but I think it's necessary. And if you ask me for my prediction of 2026, I see the relative weight of these different formats moving more in the directions of coalitions of the willing. And that will probably be a necessity to provide Ukraine with. And as you know, at the Institute, we try to provide ideas on how that can be done concretely. And next year, you yourself will lead a project on empowering Ukraine, which I think goes a little bit in this direction.
Well, thanks a lot, Stephen. Yes, this Empowering Ukraine project, just for our viewers and listeners, sort of follows on a project that we did this year on empowering Russia.
Correct.
Right. So this is something that we feel is also important to address, how we not just empower Russia, important as it is. And I do believe that, we put together a very concrete set of proposals how this can be done, in addition to deterring Russia and increasing our resilience against the ever more brazen hybrid campaigns that Russia conducts across Europe, but also this element. Now we start having questions flowing in, so already. I would invite our audience to ask questions, have comments. In the meantime, I would perhaps just add a point on the security guarantees and sort of develop the point. I think that you mentioned, Stephen. It's sort of not just the shape of the agreement that we take on how to fund Ukraine, or if the reparations loan or another means is chosen, but how the money is actually used, because it's one of the means that we as the EU really have to shape the outcome of the conflict, to strengthen Ukraine's hand. And it's my belief, at least, that we should not think about this as just sort of buying more time for Ukraine. Of course, I mean, we need to take this sort of broader strategic view, and we do know that Russia's economy is sort of a leaky ship, and the structural issues come to surface, and they are very likely to be aggravated as time goes on. But the timelines may be sort of different. We may not have as much time as we want. So that's at least sort of my belief, that we should not just agree, and hopefully, the leaders will agree on substantially supporting Ukraine in over the next period, but also on doing it in a way that really can make a difference. Because there's of course a lot of discussion still about security guarantees, and this will be something once put in place as part of some sort of future arrangements to halt the war. It will have different components, right? There may be a security guarantee somehow involving the Americans, who still speak about a NATO-like guarantee, right? But I think it's very important here to remember that the actual Article 5, the wording of Article 5, is not what sort of gives its credibility, its strength. It's really the deployment of military hardware, right? It's the plan. It's kind of so political predictability built over time that makes Article 5 such a strong deterrent and sort of the cornerstone of the alliance. So important as it is, I still continue to believe. Also, we have this proposal for multinational reassurance force, but still, I believe that the strong Ukraine with well-armed and prepared defense forces is kind of the ultimate security guarantee, and we have, as the EU, means to contribute to build this very strong Ukraine.
No, I agree. And a final sentence from me, perhaps before we go to the questions,
Sure.
Just to build on that. You're right. I mean, if you look at the actual wording of Article 5, it's not so strict. Huh? It says that you will come to the support of an ally that is attacked, but it doesn't define the means and the exact modalities and the form that support.
Exactly. That's the measures that the parties deem necessary, right? This is the wording. No.
That's the wording. So, I may send a telegram and I say, well, of course, what NATO has built up over decades, and that makes Article 5 worth it, is indeed a whole integrated military structure with deployment of American forces included in that on the whole of the Allied territory. Now, we all know, and Zelensky has confirmed earlier this week, that NATO membership is not feasible under the present political conditions in any event. And we know for Washington is not acceptable, perhaps also not for other Europeans. But the point of presence of non-Ukrainian forces on Ukrainian territory in the future, I think is a very relevant, let's say, sort of yardstick by which we can measure whether we are making progress in this area of security guarantees, or whether this is essentially a lot of beautiful words, but on which Ukrainians may have doubt. And I think as you know, there's a proposal also for the Europeans to do some training on Ukrainian territory, perhaps not on the front line, but a bit further, perhaps in Western Ukraine. The harsh reality, with all my strong support and sympathy for the Ukrainian cause, the harsh reality is that there is a problem of manpower. There is a problem of attrition, and that is partly the consequence of training and equipment, not fully, but partly. And if we could, and at the Ukrainian request, move in that direction, I think that would be helpful in this sort of idea of a porcupine strategy to make Ukraine as strong as possible, to be have a strong deterrent as possible for a non-resumption to deter Russia from starting the war, if it ever chooses to stop the war, into the future. It will be an added benefit as well, because if Europeans would do that, I think European governments would insist on providing air support and air cover for any kind of deployment. That has the added benefit that we help to secure part of the airspace of at least part of Ukraine, so that limited capacities can be redeployed elsewhere. So it would have all sorts of positive effects, while making clear that Europeans are not going to be the one, I think, in the first line of defense, really at the line of contact in the Donbass and elsewhere. So I think that this is part of this whole discussion around security guarantees, to make it as credible as possible whilst also making it, let's say, live within the political constraints that do exist in all of our countries. But if it's okay, I suggest that you lead
Yes.
our section on the Q&A, please.
Yeah, sure. So let me read some of the questions that we received. I will read several, and then Stephen, maybe you can start responding to the ones that you like. So the first question is on Eurobonds, right? The Frugals have been always the question goes reticent to talk about funding through Eurobonds, but will the pressure increase to do something akin to Eurobonds like the EU did in COVID? So that's a potential alternative proposal for funding, but perhaps not just the assistance to Ukraine, but even our common defense build up, right? Now, QMV, do you think that reparations loan may be approved via the QMV without Belgium's support? Of course, very, very political question. I think we sort of touched on it already on the stakes of this, but maybe we can develop a little bit. Yeah, and what is the way basically to convince those not currently on board to agree to the reparations loan? What sort of guarantees might be enough sort of to make this happen? So which question
I'll happily start, but you should also come in because you followed all these issues. Listen, indeed, the question of Euro bonds is one that has been part of the European discussion for decades even. And I think the lineup of political forces on this issue is quite well known. Then the pandemic happened, and we took an exceptional decision under those exceptional circumstances. And I think for me, politically, it comes down to an assessment whether you think the present condition in which we are today, with a war of aggression and imperialism in Ukraine and a wider hostility from Russia, with an uncertainty around the United States, with an increasing belligerence also coming from China and everything else that's going on, do you think those geopolitical factors require, therefore, us to take, again, the assessment that these are crisis situations that call for very bold and I recognize politically difficult decisions or not? And I come from a country where this is not popular, but I think that this has merit. In my view, this has merit because it's the organization of the defense of Europeans in the present circumstances requires colossal sums of money. And it must, in my view, in the way my interpretation of what the European Union is all about, is also that we must do important things together. But I'm well experienced enough that I know that this is a hard sell in some countries. So we'll see where eventually people end up. And maybe a second point on this QMV issue. Similarly, I mean, I've been an advocate of using more QMV also in areas of foreign policy. The point I wanted to make on it is that the goal is not to take votes, to outvote a country. The goal is to trigger a process of negotiations. That what is very detrimental, very harmful to our ability to act at speed and at scale that is required, is if countries just sit on their position and say, lean back, say, sorry, I can't go, I can't agree. What you need to do, and this also happens elsewhere in the EU, including in fields where national interests are important, in trade or migration, is that by allowing for the possibility of a vote, you oblige countries to form coalitions, to negotiate, to say, okay, but what if I do this? And what if you give me that? And what if we collectively did something else? And I think that process is what QMV is all about. The goal is not to vote. The goal, in my view, the goal is not to vote. The goal is to arrive collectively at a decision that moves forward, but that takes care of the fundamental interests of particularly countries that are very, very directly exposed, as is presently the case, and we know it. And my read of the situation is the proposals of the Commission and is that they exactly try to do that they try to allay the concerns that particularly Belgium has. And we'll see if eventually this is gonna end up in the judgment of Belgium, but also in the judgment of the group, in the assessment of the group, because we need to assess this and come out of this together. So these are my two thoughts on those questions. Please, you.
No, absolutely. I would just add to this because we were also, short on time already. This is still an open question. It's still sort of afoot. The EU ambassadors are again, in talks as we speak ahead of the council meeting tomorrow. Maybe it's suffice to say that the Commission really tried in the proposal to create sort of this kind of layered protection for anyone engaged in this question. There is sort of this kind of no claims clause, right? No award decided outside the EU could be enforced within the EU. There is the prohibition of transfer of the immobilized assets to Russia. There is the liquidity mechanism as a safety net, so the funds would be immediately available should, according to the Commission, this kind of very unlikely case should the award be really successful. There is a new proposed sanction mechanism deterring expropriation of European assets in other jurisdictions. So whether this will be enough, ultimately this is a political question. And as you say, it's not about just one member state, it's also for the others, because the very idea built into this that the risk is sort of mutualized, right? So everyone sort of partakes. So everyone will have to agree. And on the QMV, I guess what matters, in my view, is that this is not some sort of an easy way out of the very difficult conundrum, but really something that shapes, coalition building and maintains the unity that we managed to achieve on Ukraine. It's something that we sometimes focus on the issues that where we don't have a complete convergence, right? But we have been able to agree on many things as the EU or great majority of member states.
I have one additional question, and I see it coming up, and I know you have thoughts on this, Andre. Listen, behind all this, and you and me are strong supporters of Ukraine, but behind all this, there is also this issue of corruption. And there are concerns that exist. And of course, we have seen recently the departure of Yarmak, and certain reports have surfaced in Ukraine. And there are some people who say, listen, before we start to make really very significant sums available through these innovative means that we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, how we need to be sure that the money is going to be well spent. And how do you address that issue? Because I see it coming up.
No, absolutely. Of course, it's a very important issue, and we cannot pretend it doesn't exist. I mean, we have that responsibility, and the support that we contemplate, the future accession of Ukraine to the EU has to somehow countenance with these issues. So we need to help Ukraine to reform, to place sufficient safeguards in place that corruption or allegations of it will not appear in the future. The question is, of course, these are very important issues, and if Ukraine is to draw together closer to the EU, they need to be addressed. The question, I think, now is whether we should focus on this while we discuss, which to me is a very immediate and strategic question, how we support Ukraine's defenses in this war. So should we really try to cover all these issues, to address all these issues, the defense and deterrence and the reform and rule of law, important as they are, in one single package, or would it be sufficient to create some sort of clear and immediate safeguards for the money that we transfer to Ukraine as part of any agreement, any framework, so that the money are used for the purpose to which they are intended. This is sort of basic transparency and accountability, right? But we maintain focus on the sort of systemic issues of rule of law and anti-corruption and whatnot, but maybe not link those two too directly, because we may end up with addressing neither very, very well. That would be sort of my take on this.
Great.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we exhausted our time in this episode. So let me thank you, Stephen. Let me thank our viewers and our listeners for spending time with us. Thanks for the questions, and happy holiday season to everyone.
See you at the next edition of Europe Responds. Thank you.
After the New Year's.
Perfect. Thank you.